Good afternoon. This is Louise joining the call.
Hi, Louise.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Jennifer McClellan's on.
Good afternoon.
Dave Marston on.
Hi, Jill Vogel is on.
Good afternoon.
As people join our conference call, if this is Jonathan from Senate IT, if you're not actively participating or speaking, if you could mute your device, it would be very helpful because we're going to have a lot of people on this call. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Senator Howe, this is April Keyes. Do you want to wait a couple more minutes before we start?
Well, I was thinking maybe 1 minute.
Okay, thank you.
People are still jumping on.
Carol Straub. I announced, I think I had it on mute when I did.
No, Carol, you're not on this call.
Oh, okay. I'll listen on the internet then.
How this is April Keyes. Do you want to wait a couple more minutes before we start?
Let's get started. Let's get started. I hope everyone on the call is well and the people you love are as well. We're in really difficult times, and part of the reason for this call is to minimize the amount of time we need to be together. Not that we don't love you, but perhaps it's better we keep our distance. Ordinarily, this briefing would take place in the old Senate chamber with staff briefing us on the budget amendments. Obviously, that's not going to happen. It would not be safe in any event. So what we're hoping is that this call will serve that purpose so that you can get any questions you have answered now before we go into the veto session. We're trying to maintain our distance and speed up the whole process for Wednesday. So just view this as our old Senate chamber briefing, and we'll get started. We're really fortunate that our Secretary of Finance, Aubrey Lane, is on the call. I particularly wanted him to explain what unallot means and how they're using it in the amendments, because the vast majority of amendments deal with unallotting parts of the budget. So, Aubrey, if you could explain it to us, that would be great.
Yes, and thank you, Madam Chair. I should also point out before I start, I have two of my team in here with me, June Jennings, Deputy Secretary, and Dan Timberlake, the Director of Department of Planning and Budget. So you'll know who's on the call from our side. Yes, we are certainly, as you point out, Madam Chair, in very, very different times. And that was one of the primary reasons for us using this term and process of unallotment. Normally, when we enter a downturn, we can sort of see it coming. We're able to at least measure some of the aspects of it That was not the case with this public health crisis. You know, we went from having one of the strongest economies in Virginia's history to basically it closing down over the last 4 or 5 weeks. So in terms of what would typically be happening, first of all here is we would go through a reforecast. But the problem is right now, and it's not just the state of Virginia, it's also businesses around the Commonwealth and around the nation. It's difficult to have a reforecast because of uncertainty. Now, you all recall back in the last meeting that I was in front of you, we talked about some of the risks that were in our economy. We talked about tariffs, and we talked about some differences and difficulties in the supply chain. But those were risks that we felt like we could quantify. I'll compare that to the uncertainty we have now. We really cannot get a handle on how quickly we're going to open back up and how quickly the consumer and the businesses are going to return to not only getting open, but the profitability. Unlike 2001, when we had September 11th, when we had the terrorist attacks, and that was a terrible time for our country and our state, the real issue coming out of it was the fear of flying. People were afraid to fly. And so the government with the TSA was able to put in procedures, and they may have been bulky and very, very cumbersome, but pretty quickly the public got over their fear of flying and were able to return to normal. That won't be the case here. First of all, even though it was a government-led shutdown because of the public health crisis, it'll have to be businesses and other things leading us out of this because the public's not going to return until they feel safe, regardless of what any president or even our governor says. Until there's some safety in that, it's going to be difficult to measure when we're going to be able to get back to anything we consider normal. So that being the case, we knew that we would not, any forecast that we would do of revenues, we know would be incorrect. Or I guess we could get very lucky and hit it, but we knew that it would probably be wrong from the amount, and we don't know how long and deep this is going to be. So in cases like that, if you were forced to do a reforecast, we would have to have picked the most pessimistic scenario. And we don't know that's going to be the case for two reasons. Number one, about when we return to normalcy, whenever that may be, or some form of it, but also the federal government and the stimulus monies. We don't know how they're going to impact us on the other side and during the time of this crisis. So that being the case, we certainly knew that while we couldn't reforecast, we could certainly project in the short term what the impacts would be to our revenues. And we expect in the next quarter, that is April through June, our final quarter and one of the most significant quarters of the year, we're expecting to be down $1 billion to what we had originally put in our budget for that quarter. We also know when we did the reforecast or the forecast last fall, and even in a mild recession or medium recession, we could expect to lose $1 billion per year out of our biennial budget. And that's what we have pretty much made public, that we know at least the rest of this year we should be down, we're probably going to be down $1 billion and $1 billion in each of the 2 years of our biennium. That we hope that is we don't hope it happens. We hope that that's the worst it can be, but there's no guarantee it won't be worse than that. On the other hand, maybe it'll be better. So with that in mind, and with the public health crisis, and we kept that in mind not only from us here at the Commonwealth responding to it, most of the day we spend are on trying to find protection equipment and trying to get testing going and those things. We also knew that we would not have the time to devote, or nor we could, starting to go through seeing which things we should cut, because we know that would require a reduction if our revenues go down. And as a matter of fact, if we do incur the $1 billion loss, that will put us over 1% down to last year, and constitutionality will require us to have a reforecast sometime in the month of July or August, because we'll have decreased more than 1% from the previous year. So all that leads us, particularly having you guys come back up here and having to go through all these amendments, to the process of unallotment. Unallotment is another term, and Dan will shoot me or hit me on the head because it's not exactly this, but it's a budgeting term that's really suspending. It's putting everything in a state of suspension, meaning that our agencies cannot spend these monies without the action of the governor and the General Assembly. So it is not cutting the budget. Those budgets are still, those numbers are, and items are still appropriated, but they cannot be spent on without future action by the General Assembly and the governor. We also did not reforecast our revenues for the reasons I just started before, in that we could not get a very good handle, at least this time, on how the economy is going to come out of this. So that's the process we chose, is to unallot, meaning suspend all spending that was either discretionary or in the biennium budget, new spending items. And we didn't pick winners and losers. If it was a new amount of spending, we basically unallotted it. The governor has reached out several times to the General Assembly and let them know that he wants to work with them. First of all, in his budget, he left $200 million that was unappropriated for you guys to use, because you had spending priorities. When we had a reforecast just a few months ago, it seems like years ago, when we thought we were going to have more money, that was left for the General Assembly to use. So in the same vein, the governor agreed to this unallotment process that basically suspends everything until we get to a point where we could have a better forecast, and working with the General Assembly, then that's when we would determine if cuts have to be permanently made. That's the appropriate way to do it. And it also is a time where you guys can come back here safely and do that, so that we're not putting you at any risk also as we go through this. So that is, in layman's terms, and how we came about with trying, as the governor puts it, to basically wait till the fog lifts, suspend everything for all the hard work y'all have done, but no, we're going to have to take action on this probably in the next few months. And we should have a little better guidance on where we are with the federal stimulus. As you know, right now, it cannot be used to fill lost revenues, but it can be used for direct costs associated with the virus. So, Madam Chair, that's the reasoning behind the approach we've taken for the unallotment or the suspension. And I want to reiterate, these costs cannot be incurred. They cannot be spent. It gives guidance to our agencies that none of this can be done without further action by the General Assembly and the governor in another session, probably in a reconvened session when we reforecast. So that's the reason behind it, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. Does anybody have a question on this?
Janet, this is Tommy.
Hi, Tommy.
Mr. Secretary, can you remind me of what the constraints are on that 15% spending rule?
Yes, sir, I can, and I'll breach this right up front, Senator. The governor has said that he will withdraw that amendment. What you basically have allowed in, I think it's Section 4 of the budget, is the governor, in times of having to cut, is allowed to do 15% across the board cuts. The governor had originally asked for additional authority to go beyond that in case our revenues with all the other mitigation factors did not work, and we had to cut further. But we have heard from you guys, and he has said he will withdraw that. He will call you, working with you, back into session to determine cuts over and above 15%.
Thank you, sir.
Is there any other question?
Janet, this is Steve Newman. Could I ask a question? First, Ms. Secretary, how do bills get implemented if they required FTEs? In other words, if the budget authorized a bill to go into effect and it required a DMV or otherwise a number of FTEs that are new, how does that impact those bills, and how do we kind of get to that? And then the second question is regarding local government. So local government should go on the budget before the allocations. Is that probably the best? So a little bit of a two-part question there.
Yeah, Senator, I'll answer the second part. That we wanted to do this to give guidance that the local government should assume that spending will not occur. So they should assume that everything that's unallotted would not be spent. We didn't do it. But we didn't do new bills. But they should be able to take from this. They can't spend. Now, the first part of your question relates to legislation that was going in or other things that had a fiscal impact. That was considered and was not unallotted. So if a bill had a fiscal impact and the governor made an amendment, we take that into account. But if no amendments or FTEs in that legislation, then those funds were not unallotted or suspended.
So, Madam Chair, just to follow up if I could. So that means that if the Attorney General's office, for instance, needed 4 FTEs for them to implement a certain bill, then the determination was that spending may continue on and will not be unallotted. Is that correct?
That is correct. If it was directly related to legislation that the governor did not amend, that was left in place. Yes, it was, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet.
Mm-hmm. If I could just follow up on that question, do you have any idea how much money we're talking about cumulative for those?
Yes, I do. Generally, it was about, I'm rounding off, it was about $30 million that was a fiscal impact. $32 million, Dan?
Yes, not including, that does not include the new spending for the personal care attendants related to minimum wage.
Right. But yeah.
That total that Secretary Lane just gave you is the approximate number of all other legislation that we did not unallot that amount of money related to that new legislation, but we did not propose to unallot that amount of money, nor did the funding for the personal care attendants. That was not unallotted either.
That is correct. So those are the two amounts, Senator, that were not unallotted. It was approximately $875 million in the first fiscal year, approximately 1.4 in the second fiscal year, 1.4 billion, but that included $300 million of a voluntary deposit to the cash reserves, so about 1.1 in actual expenditures.
Are there any further questions?
Janet, this is Dave Martin.
Yes. Sure, Dave.
And Aubrey, are the feds expected to hand down a set of guidelines or rules, if you will, on what qualifies for federal assistance based on the pandemic? And how flexible do you think they're going to be on that, or is it going to be a very tightly construed set of rules as to what you can claim?
The answer is we do expect to get guidance. We've been expecting it now for several weeks. We've been given different dates. I will note, though, that on Thursday of last evening, we did receive $1.65 billion from the federal authorities. We expect that represents half of the $3.3 billion that the state was to get, $1.8 billion for the state, 1.5 for localities. So we assume that the monies we got was $900 million for the state's share and $750 million of monies for localities. Now, I say we assume that because there was no guidance given. The money just showed up in our account, which we're thankful for. We do know the 3 restrictions now are that the money cannot, it must be spent by December 30th of this year. It has to be used for direct expenditures for the COVID-19, and it cannot have been in a budget previous to, I think, March 27th. It has to be unbudgeted previous to subsequent to that amount. Now, we also received verbal guidance from the Treasury that these monies could not be used for the fulfillment or to replacement of lost revenues from the Commonwealth. They had to be for direct expenditures related to the virus. So they said they were going to be expansive in what that meant, but we have not received further guidance. We would expect things like social services, medical assistance, PPE, protection equipment, testing. Those would be certainly things that we would anticipate that would be allowed. How more expansive from that, we don't know in that regard. We have had several talks with our congressional delegation, and the governor has written letters asking for more flexibility in the use of those funds. We've also heard talk there could be another part of the CARES Act that would be directly related to states, but heretofore that's just been talk. We don't know. So we're expecting guidance. We'd like to get it because certainly we know our localities need money. A complicating factor is the county of Fairfax, with a population over 500,000, was allowed to directly access their monies from the federal government. We don't know that if that is inclusive of the monies they've sent us, or it's going to be taken out of the next bit of money we get on behalf of the localities. And we also got word Friday or Saturday, the days are running together, that Prince William County has combined with the city of Manassas and Manassas Park, or the towns up there, and they have made a direct application to the federal authorities. So we're trying to get some guidance as to how that's going to actually be allocated, and if, for instance, the monies for Fairfax include all the localities in there, or is that going to be a separate amount? So those are the questions we've asked for guidance. We try to reach out every day. It's not just us. I mean, the rest of the states are doing the same, but as of today, we do not have specific guidance onto the use of the funds. The governor did certify when we got the funds that they would be used for those three purposes, or in compliance with those three limitations that I spoke of earlier. So, Senator Martin, that's where we are today with the stimulus funds.
Madam Chair, this is Senator Favola. I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Lane, when the local governments get their allocations, other than the framework that you outlined, that they have to spend it by December 30th, or it must have been something that had been unbudgeted, et cetera, other than that framework, will the local governments have flexibility in spending their allocation?
That is one of the questions. We've asked them, do they have to have the same certification? The guidance we've gotten is no locality can spend them for other than direct costs of the virus. In other words, the localities would have the same restrictions. So that's one of the questions we've asked before we allocate is what certification and what compliance follow-up will the state need to do, if any, once it allocates the monies to the localities?
One follow-up question, Madam Chair?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Will the state be adding any additional criteria?
That has not been discussed, Senator, but I would not think we would ask the localities to do anything that we wouldn't be, but that has not been discussed by the governor's policy department. And it's unclear if, one of the things we originally had talked about, since it was based on population, that's what we would use to get monies to the localities relatively quickly, at least the first tranche. But these other issues popped up. So right now we're waiting on guidance, but we've not specifically talked about that, but I can't imagine us asking the localities to do anything more strict than what the feds have asked of us for the monies.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Okay, Aubrey, thank you so much. This is very helpful.
Thank you. We'll just go on mute.
Just keep yourself well because we're dependent on you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll put my phone on mute and we'll continue to listen. If anything is needed, just call on us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our Senate Finance and Appropriations staff has prepared briefing papers for us on the amendments. Hopefully you have them electronically so you can look them over. And April, can you give a quick overview on what these are?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Of the main thing we're going to cover, we're going to quickly just cover a couple pages in the PowerPoint because Aubrey actually spoke to a number of the things I think that you would have had questions about. So on slide 2, this is just reiterating that, it's kind of uncertain times. Reforecast will likely be necessary, but in the current fiscal year, these last few months here, they think it's going to be approximately down about $1 billion. And so we're turning to the amendments for House Bill 29 and 30. And Madam Chair, I will just reiterate, as you had at the beginning of the call, for those who come on later or have just come on, if you can push *6 to mute and *6 to unmute when you have questions. And I believe the Chair's plan was to hold questions on the amendments till the end of House Bill 29, and then we'll cover House Bill 30. There are 37 amendments to House Bill 29. There are about 144 in House Bill 30, but a large number of those are the unallot amendments that Aubrey spoke about. Slide 3 just summarizes a number of the items discussed in House Bill 30 on those unallot amendments. Aubrey kind of called it suspension. We might refer to it as a pause or freezing until the General Assembly returns to spending. Those amounts for 21 and 22 are summarized on page 3. There's also some direct general fund appropriation changes, including the deposit to the revenue reserve voluntary deposit that Aubrey also mentioned. And so you can see between the two what the impacts are, and across all 3 years, about $2.9 billion. Slide 4 just provides some additional detail. I won't cover that. And then slide 5 just gives you a little more a more detailed look at the unallot amendments. There are about 80 amendments that refer to operating, and then there are 3 additional amendments in capital outlay. So I'll move on to House Bill 29. The slides in the PowerPoint, for the members of the committee, you might remember I previously have sent a sort of spreadsheet summary as well by sort of the staff category, the guess of what those might fall into in case you wanted to consider those in a block or some of those together, or look at a particular type of amendment. These are the amendment numbers, and they include a summary page number as I go along. These are not listed in order, but I'm going to cover them in order from the narrative summary that I sent earlier today, which is also posted on our website for anybody else who may have trouble finding that. And the plan is I'll quickly go through them. If there are questions at the end, the individual staff member who prepared the amendment will answer those questions. So starting with amendment number 1, this is just the changes relate on the front page of the budget, item 0, and this makes some additions to the balance related to the governor's actions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That includes the sum sufficient disaster declaration authorization of about $55.5 million and a deficit authorization for housing of about $2.5 million for the need to provide some temporary shelter for the high-risk homeless. Amendment 2, you might remember these were conference amendments that did a transfer of the executive mansion staff back to DGS. The governor's amendments number 2 and number 3 ask that we undo that, or ask that you undo that action. It's varying amounts you'll see between those 2 amendments and about 4 positions. Moving on to amendment number 4, this one falls under the Virginia Employment Commission related to unemployment insurance flexibility. This particular amendment would give the governor the authority to override provisions of the Virginia Unemployment Compensation Act in response to this pandemic. This would allow the governor to waive some work search requirements for benefit recipients in order to lessen the spread of the virus. According to the agency, it was not their thought to have substantive changes to the existing law. However, the language is written in a way that might perhaps be unnecessarily broad. Amendment number 5 is under the Department of Education. This has to do with some temporary flexibility or waivers in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It provides the superintendent of public instruction the ability to grant some flexibility or waivers for certain deadlines and requirements under the Appropriations Act and the code. The flexibility and the waivers can include, but aren't limited to, things like accreditation, testing, assessments, graduation, licensure, school calendars, etc. And it only applies to deadlines in fiscal year 20 and 21. Amendment number 6, direct aid to public education. This one is so that the supplemental lottery per pupil payments can be prorated. The enrolled Big Bill, House Bill 30, has identical language, so we would consider this more of a technical amendment. Amendment number 7, related to direct aid to public education again. This one waives some required local effort and match obligations due to the pandemic. Amendment 8 is under the Department of Accounts. This is what was mentioned previously, removing the planned voluntary revenue reserve deposit of $601.8 million. Moving on to amendment number 9, under the Department of Medical Assistance Services. This action provides some general funds of about $309,000 and some non-general funds for emergency actions that have been taken by the department for costs of policy changes implemented to respond to COVID-19. Those include things like the elimination of co-pays for medical services, no need for pre-approval, automatic extensions, some outreach to higher risk and older members for critical needs, allowing a 90-day supply of many routine prescriptions, and making sure members don't inadvertently lose coverage due to lapses in paperwork, and encouraging the use of telehealth. The primary cost driver on that one is the elimination of the co-pays, which are minimal in Medicaid. Amendment number 10 also has to do with the Department of Medical Assistance Services, and this is the increase in nursing facility rates in response to the pandemic. The governor's action increases the daily per diem rates for nursing homes by about $20 for the response to reflect the higher nursing costs related to staffing, purchase of personal protection equipment, and additional cleaning. No appropriation, however, is provided, and this is based on the assumption that other fees for service costs for medical service will be lower related to some other activities that are not taking place, and that the appropriation would be sufficient to cover the costs. The costs that will occur in Medicaid managed care, which will be the majority of that, will require those organizations to make the additional payment with no change in the rates. And if you have questions on that, Mike can go into more detail later. Amendment number 11, also related to the Department of Medical Assistance Services. This is authority for changes to Medicaid in response to the pandemic. It provides broad authority for the department to make emergency changes to the program. It suspends the normal review requirement for those changes that requires the governor to provide the written approval of such actions. DMAS is required to notify the chairs of the House Appropriations and Senate Finance and Appropriations Committees within 15 days of any actions that are taken. All such emergency actions shall expire at the end of the emergency declaration. Staff will just note that it's unclear what other actions are needed to take place and any specific authority that wasn't sent down in another amendment. Amendment 12, also the Department of Medical Assistance Services. This one relates to flexibility to adjust payment dates. The governor's action would add language allowing the department to adjust the date of agency payments if doing so would allow the agency to maximize federal reimbursement if such a payment is allowable under state and federal rules. You might have heard that under the Federal Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was enacted in March, that Medicaid federal match rate for traditional Medicaid was increased from the matching rate of 50 to 56.2% for each quarter that the coronavirus public health emergency exists. Amendment 13 also relates to the Department of Medical Assistance Services. This one unallots state savings from the enhanced federal match rate for Medicaid that I also just mentioned. That would unallot that money, and then DPB is required to report to the chairs. And and DPB can also is authorized to unallot the state savings. Under the staff note, you'll see that the estimate for the last 2 quarters of 20 are general fund savings of about $315 million. And if that emergency were to continue for the first 2 quarters of the next fiscal year in fiscal 2021, the estimate is that the state would realize an additional $330 million in savings. Amendment 14 is to increase the Child Care and Development Block Grant. This one provides $66 million in federal appropriation from the Child Care and Development Block Grant in 20 to be used for incentive grants to child care providers for emergency child care, the elimination of copays for subsidy program participants, and the extensions of absent days to temporary closed child care centers. And that was federal funding provided under the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. Amendment 15 is to increase the Child Care and Development Block Grant appropriation to spend balances. This adds $2 million in federal appropriations in this fiscal year to spend down the Child Care Development Fund balances to fund full-day authorization for child care for school-aged children and siblings enrolled for families already approved for this care. And it's also in response to the public health emergency, and there are sufficient balances there as well. Amendment number 16 under the Department of Social Services, this one allots of state savings from that enhanced federal match rate for federal foster care. That also relates to the increase in the CARES Act. That match rate is also used in Title 4E of the Federal Foster Care Program, and that's where that funding comes into play. Amendment number 17, also under the Department of Social Services, related to authority for licensure exemption and background check portability for child day programs. This adds language providing an exemption from the licensure for a child daycare program operating for children of essential personnel during the pandemic. The program has to, though, file an exemption with the department and abide by basic safety requirements and guidance from the CDC and the Virginia Department of Health. And the Department of Social Services does have the authority to inspect those programs. It also modifies the background check requirements for child day programs to allow the personnel who've completed a background check in the past 2 years to have portability with that. It also allows public or private schools to operate emergency child care for preschool or school-aged children for essential personnel as well. Moving on to Amendment 18, also in the Department of Social Services, this relates to authority for emergency program changes. This proposes to give authority to the department to make changes to its programs with the appropriate approval from federal agencies, if required, including eligibility criteria for benefits and services. And DSS must then receive written approval from the governor and then notify the chairs of the money committees of those changes. Amendment 19 relates to the Secretary of Natural Resources and Wildlife Impact on Transportation Projects. It provides language directing the Secretary of Natural Resources with support from the Secretary of Transportation to work with agencies in that secretariat to identify wildlife habitat impacted by transportation projects. This is one in a series of amendments that provides $12 million non-general funds for the removal and remediation of migratory shorebird nesting sites identified on South Island of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. There's a companion amendment under the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries related to permits as well, and another amendment, as I mentioned, under the Department of Transportation for that $12 million non-general funds for removal and remediation of identified nests and eggs. Amendment 20 is
April.
Yes.
This is Chap Peterson.
Yes,
I guess
Peterson.
I had a question. I don't know, somebody needs to mute, but my question is, why are we doing that right now? I mean, that's $12 million for birds. Seems to me that we got people that are unemployed. Why would we be spending money on birds?
I'm going to let Jason Powell on our staff answer that one for me. Jason, are you there? Are you unmuted? Senator Peterson, why don't we come back to that one, because I know there are some very specific things that led to that particular amendment, or if Aubrey or Dan Timberlake want to jump in and weigh in on that as well, they can.
April, would you like us to wait till Jason comes back on?
No, you can. I think it would be fine with the chair, if it's fine with the chair.
Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator. This relates to getting the state DEQ permit that is necessary for the construction of the tunnel to continue. And so it is time dependent. The Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel contract is in procurement and going through a very time dependent issue. If that delay in permitting was interrupted, in other words, if it was a substantial delay, it was determined it would be much more than $12 million necessary to keep this, that we would lose in contract by keeping this on track. So that was the thinking. There may be some other technical issues that Jason, but the overall thinking was so we would not delay the construction of the tunnel in Hampton Roads.
Madam Chair, sorry, I had the wrong phone keypad opened and couldn't unmute in time. Concur with everything that Secretary Lane has said. Would note that the federal EPA changed interpretation of various migratory bird rules a few years back. This is a state-protected species. It is currently there. The $12 million is all from VDOT transportation funds, so it's not a general fund that could easily be deployed for COVID response, save possibly for public transit type purposes. It comes from access road funds and from trail access road programs and economic development programs managed by VDOT. And it's intended to last the entire life, to do mitigation throughout the life of the HRBT contract.
Okay, Jack?
All right, Madam Chair, if you're fine, I will continue.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Amendment that 20 is the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries amendment that is related to that. And I'm going to skip ahead on that. And then I'm also going to skip Amendment 22 as Jason and Aubrey both just spoke to the Department of Transportation amendment there. So in between is Amendment 21 under the Department of Corrections. And this would authorize the director to reassign or discharge certain prisoners from incarceration or into a lower level of supervision, including probation, home electronic incarceration, or community corrections. Any prisoner, though, except for those convicted of a Class 1 felony or sexually violent offense with less than 1 year remaining on their sentence, and if it is determined that that action will assist in maintaining health, safety, and welfare of the prisoner, and is compatible with the interests of society and public safety. The authority is limited to when the governor's declared state of emergency is in effect in response to COVID-19 in this particular situation. It does require the DOC director to develop procedures for implementing the authority to comply with statutory requirements for providing notice of the prisoner's discharge to the extent that's practicable. And the authority expires on July 1, 2021. There's a companion amendment, however, in House Bill 30. Staff would just note under the notes section, it talks about the process under current parole, and that this particular amendment does not involve the parole board, which is the entity that currently makes those release decisions. The Secretary of Public Safety did indicate that there are about just under 2,000 prisoners that would be eligible potentially based on the remaining sentence length. And as I mentioned, I was going to skip Amendment number 22 when we got there. Amendment 23 is the one under Central Appropriations, and this one is related to the COVID-19 Response Authority match appropriations. It provides $50 million general funds in the second year as anticipated state matching funds related to COVID-19 federal grants to address this pandemic. It would authorize the governor to appropriate funds to agencies, higher ed institutions, and other permissible entities for federal relief funds provided under the CARES Act or other legislation related to the pandemic. It also requires state agency and entity records management and reporting consistent with federal and state requirements and quarterly reporting to the Money Committee chairs. It authorizes the governors to appropriate within item 476.10 or other items in the Appropriation Act revenues deposited to the COVID-19 Relief Fund, which I'll refer to as the Relief Fund, which it would be created pursuant to the proposed substitutes to Senate Bill 971 and House Bill 881, out of the 2020 General Assembly session, which prohibited certain games of skill. This relief fund would be established, and then 84% of the monthly revenues generated from that would be dedicated here from July 1, 2020 through July 1, 2021. It authorizes that those funds be used for, but not limited to, relief to small businesses, assistance for housing and homelessness, assistance for long-term care facilities, and other purposes as designated by the governor to address the pandemic. Again, there's quarterly reporting to the money committees. There is a companion amendment in House Bill 30 as well, amendment number 123. Just to note, there's approximately, Aubrey mentioned this, $3.3 billion in federal funding anticipated to come to Virginia under those various acts that are listed there under the notes. Amendment 24 has to do with capital outlay. And under the general conditions, it delays the implementation of capital projects. This would add language allowing the governor or his designee to delay the initiation or continuation, and note continuation, of capital projects supported by state revenues in order to address cash flow and debt capacity concerns resulting from the pandemic. There's a companion amendment, again, in House Bill 30, Amendment number 126, with an added provision that the General Assembly reauthorize the capital budget when it next reconvenes and accepts a revenue forecast that confirms the revenues in the Act. And the staff just note the concern related to the continuation of capital projects. Amendment 25 is under Part 3, interfund transfers, requiring COVID-19 FEMA reimbursements to be transferred to the general fund. Certain ones, this is transferring federal cost recoveries from the Department of Emergency Management, or VDEM, to the general fund related to FEMA reimbursements in each fiscal year. Amendment number 26 has to do with auxiliary enterprises in higher education. It adds language allowing the institutions of higher education flexibility from recovering 100% of the calculated indirect cost recoveries to the education in general, or E&G, academic activities. The amendment explanation suggests that the institutions have, and staff have been reported to about concerning this. They've taken a hit against their cash balances with closing the dormitories, parking and dining operations, et cetera, and many of them have done refunds related to the auxiliary enterprises. There's a companion amendment as well in House Bill 30. Amendment number 27 relates to administrative tax relief in the abatement of interest. It requires the Department of Taxation or Tax to waive interest for final estimated or extension of individual, corporate, or fiduciary income tax payments that were originally due from the period of April 1 through June 1 of this year, provided that the full payment is made by June 1, and also sales tax payments originally due March 2020, for which a waiver was granted, provided that such payment is made by April 2020. So moving on to Amendment 28, in your narrative summary, we're on page 22. Under Part 4, allowing policymaking boards to meet virtually during emergency declarations. This allows for public bodies, which would include agencies, boards, and common interest communities, to conduct electronic meetings during a declared state of emergency when it's impracticable or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location. There's a companion amendment in House Bill 30, Amendment number 137. Amendment number 29 has to do with increasing higher educational institute reserve amounts. It increases the percentage from 3 to 6 of education in general, E&G unexpended balances for institutions to carry forward as a reserve to be available during times of revenue challenges. There's a companion amendment in House Bill 30, Amendment number 139, which I will plan to skip when we get there as well. Amendment 30, related to non-general fund revenues. This one provides authority for agencies to solicit and accept donations, gift grants, and contracts to support the response to the COVID pandemic. That one has a companion amendment in House Bill 30 as well, Amendment number 140. Pre-existing Part 4 language prohibits those actions without the written approval of the governor. Amendment number 31, this has to do with deficit authorizations and treasury loans, and this is allowing anticipatory treasury loans for higher ed institutions. They can request one of these treasury loans to address cash flow needs resulting from the loss of the auxiliary revenue that I previously mentioned. The Secretary of Finance would develop guidelines to evaluate those requests received from those institutions. Amendment number 32, under Part 4, related to special conditions and restrictions on expenditures, authority to change cost factors in response to the pandemic. This one proposes to allow state agencies to alter cost factors for services that are implemented or altered in response to the pandemic, provided from a non-general fund source, though, or any source when specifically, or other source when specifically approved by the governor in response to the pandemic. Staff would just note that changes to cost factors and levels that control the number of eligible recipients or unit costs of benefit payments are limited to appropriations specifically provided by the General Assembly for such change currently. And that relates to the General Assembly's authority to appropriate public funds. Governor has authority under disaster declarations to respond to emergencies until such times as the Assembly could address underlying fiscal costs. And it's unclear why the additional, there were other specific amendments. It might be unclear as to why this request is there. Under Amendment number 33, there are special conditions or restrictions on expenditures to establish new services. Similarly, state agencies can establish new services in response to COVID-19 if the funding is provided from a non-general source or other source. Amendment number 34 would fall under a more technical amendment. This one's under special conditions and restrictions on expenditures related to the Hampton Roads Unmanned Systems Park. You might remember in the conference report there were actually amendments in both the caboose bill and the big bill related to updating this language. The governor's actions further changes parts of the language and specifically asked the Department of General Services to clarify the surplus property. It also strikes the ability of the authority to waive the Eastern Virginia Regional Industrial Facility Authority to waive an appraisal requirement. And then it clarifies the amount of the conveyance of a property to a utility-scale solar facility at 150 acres. Amendment number 35, relating to reporting requirements. This is provides flexibility on reporting deadlines during the declared disaster. The governor can temporarily delay or defer submission of reports or studies, et cetera, that are required by the Code or the Appropriation Act. The request for the delay must be submitted in writing at least 30 days prior to that deadline, though, and must be submitted as soon as the work can be completed, but no later than 12 months from the original requirement. Amendment number 36, Part 4 effective dates. This relates to additional enactments for legislation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's a more lengthy and very specific write-up for this one, but it includes an enactment to move the general and special elections scheduled to be held on May 5th to November 3rd and directs the Department of Elections to promulgate instructions for the implementation of the delay with some additional provisions. And I won't list out all the provisions, but they're there for your benefit, as I know this one has been already discussed in detail with many of you. And there are some additional notes as well on that one. Amendment 37, and this has to do with authorizing temporary borrowing. And there's a companion amendment in House Bill 30 as well. This one includes language authorizing the Treasury Board consistent with the consent of the governor to issue revenue anticipation notes to address cash flow and liquidity for both the state and localities for fiscal year 2020. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail on this, but under the CARES Act, there was mentioned that the Federal Reserve has authorized up to $500 billion to lend to states and municipalities to manage reductions in cash flows caused by an extension. However, these would have to be paid back within, I believe, 12 months. And if there are questions on this, since we're at the end, both Jason and Mike might have more detail. And I know when I previously spoke with the Secretary of Finance, it might be that not both amendments are needed, but maybe one or the other in either Senate Bill 20 or House Bill 29 and 30. Madam Chair, that completes my covering of the amendments of House Bill 29. If you'd like to pause for questions.
Yes, I would. Does anyone have questions on 29?
Hi, Madam Chair. This is Senator Bell. Quick question. I don't know if it's covered really by any of these amendments here or in general, or Secretary Lane could jump in, but I wanted to find out if I could speak about how the processing and handling of unemployment claims is being handled Do we have enough resources to handle that, and are they being handled in a timely manner is kind of my question.
Yes. April, would you like me to respond to that?
Yeah, I know this has been covered in a number of the calls and on the briefing, so I would like for you to, if you could. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll be happy to get with you. Dr. Megan Healy is the one heading this up. And yes, we have applied for and received additional unemployment benefits from the feds. And it did require new programming and additional staffing. I know there's at least 2 centers more across the Commonwealth, been up to speed or getting up to speed, Senator Bell. But Megan Healy would be the one who could give you specifics, and I'm happy to get her with you. But we have had to do quite a bit of upgrade to our system and to open up additional facilities and hiring for those facilities.
Madam Chair, just quick follow-up if I could.
Sure.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for that. My question, I guess, would be, do you have any idea what kind of a processing time frame, any ballpark on how long it takes to get benefits?
Yes. First of all, I do know that anybody who has been delayed will be retroactively compensated for the time in which they filed initially were laid off. So I do know that. Subject to the provisions of the Act, which I believe were March 27th or 28th. I can check that. So anybody that has been delayed will get retroactive payment. I know the first week it did not include the additional $600 per week from the federal authorities because the funding hadn't gotten in, but that is in now. And so my understanding is right now, Senator, they are much better. I can't say they're up to date, and I can get Dr. Healy to respond directly to you, but I do know that anything that's retroactive will be paid the recipient.
Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Secretary.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's go on then to House Bill.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
This is Emmett.
Hey, Emmett.
How are you today? Amendment number 14, dealing with Child Care Development Block Grant under the CARES Act, the additional $66 million. Is there flexibility that any of that money could be directed to child care providers that currently are not receiving federal money?
Madam Chair, this is Mike Tweedy. Senator Hinger, that's something actually I can look into. Certainly, there's a lot more flexibility that the feds are providing to kind of deal with the crisis. So I think it is a possibility, but I'll double check and get you an answer.
Okay, I'll follow up with you on that. Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Okay, anything else on 29? All right, let's go to 30. And April, if you could not do the ones that were in 29 and not do the unallot.
Yes, Madam Chair.
I would encourage everyone to look at the unallot. I think it'll break your heart. The only way I sort of keep positive is that we're basically going back to last year's budget. And at the time, we thought it was very good. So let's see how we end up now. Okay, April.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will try to move very quickly, and I will do my best to not cover any of those amendments that were companions. The first amendment is just the front page amendment, and that it reflects the changes that have had to be made or are being proposed in the caboose bill with the governor's amendments, and essentially that increases the unreserved balance from about $692 million to about $1.2 billion rolling forward. And of course, that would be dependent on whether that additional liquidity is needed in this current fiscal year. The next amendment is the summary of those unallot new spending amendments. And there's ones for each agency. And as the chair mentioned, there's an unallot amendment spreadsheet that went out to the committee members that summarizes all of that new spending, so I won't spend any time on that. But that covers a big number. For the operating amendments, that's 80 amendments right there that we just covered. So amendment number 5 and amendment number 8, those two relate to that DGS transfer of executive mansion staff, undoing what was adopted in the conference report. Amendment 7, which is in between those two, has to do with just a technical update to a property transfer, so that would fall under the technical category. Moving on to amendment number 11. This one is related to providing language to give legislative authorization for an agricultural hemp research pilot program consistent with the federal farm bill, and that's under the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Amendment number 15, under the Department of Housing and Community Development, this is waiving a match requirement for homeless services. The current law requires a minimum match of 25%, and this would waive that and applies to an annual appropriation of about $3.5 million. The next amendment, amendment number 16, also under DHCD, this has to do with Housing Trust Fund flexibility. It would provide the department some flexibility in the allocation of the Housing Trust Fund awards to address both homelessness assistance and other housing issues resulting from the COVID pandemic. And there's some additional staff notes there. Amendment number 22, under the Virginia Employment Commission, this one gives the governor the authority to override the current provisions of the Unemployment Compensation Act. And we'll skip forward. Amendment 24, this is related to the Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority, related to allowing some authorizing under CCAM to provide grants dedicated to matching funds for the purpose of attracting federal funds for research projects related to the pandemic. The grants still have to be matched on a one-to-one basis. Amendment 25 is under the Virginia Innovation Partnership Authority. This would reduce general fund support and expand uses of non-general funds. This is a very more detailed amendment. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but Charles Kennington on our staff can go through it. But essentially, it reduces the first year appropriations by $6.1 million general funds, and there it's included about where that which programs that comes from. It also removes language that directs the use of the non-general fund from the sale of the current CIT building, and instead allows for the new board to decide how to allocate that. It also authorizes grants, loans, investments, or other resources for young companies that have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. Amendment 26 under the Department of Education. Again, this is, I'm going to skip ahead because this is, again, a flexibility around temporary flexibility and waivers. Amendment 28 relates to, it's under direct aid to public education. This one relates to school counselor ratios. The General Assembly action is provided there for you. And the governor's action adds notwithstanding language to maintain the staffing ratios for counselors at the level funded in Chapter 854 for this current fiscal year, which reduces spending by $21.7 million the first year and $28.4 million the second year. There's some additional notes there as well. Amendment 30 relates to the tuition assistance or TAG grant requirements under the State Council of Higher Education. This one adds language to allow for possible COVID-19 student displacements this fall and clarifies phase out and eligibility requirements for TAG awards to Virginia residents attending Virginia-based private not-for-profit institutions of higher ed. Amendment number 39 under Norfolk State, this adds language allowing the university to utilize any year-end balances from state funds provided to meet the requirements of Virginia's settlement with the Federal Office of Civil Rights for the purpose of addressing any educational, general, or auxiliary funding issues. So that provides some additional flexibility for them. The same amendment or similar amendment is done for Virginia State University on amendment number 51. Amendment number 68 relates to delaying the report on the study of collective bargaining under the Secretary of Finance. It delays the issuance of that report for collective bargaining for state employees by 1 year until November 1 of 2021. Amendment number 69, this is a technical adjustment to the recordation tax language. It states that notwithstanding the provisions of 58.1-816 Code of Virginia, the $20 million general fund appropriations each year for the recordation tax revenues are not subject to the sum sufficient provisions of the item. And again, there's some additional staff notes below. We're on page 14 of your narrative. Amendment number 72 under the CSA requires an interim report on special education private day. This will allow JLARC to receive some better information prior to the report that's due on September 1, 2020. It reports that information to JLARC by then, and the language requires the final report to go to the money committees by June 1, 2021. Amendment number 74 expands the acting reversible contraception program. It modifies that language that passed during the regular session and allows for funding for non-hormonal long-acting reversible contraception, or LARCs. So it would allow the copper intrauterine device to be eligible for reimbursement under the program. Amendment number 76 of the Department of Medical Assisted Services funds Medicaid's initial COVID-19 response. I won't take a lot of time on this one because it's very similar and it relates to those copays, et cetera, and those things that were mentioned in 29. Amendment number 77 is also one that we talked about in 29. This is the one that increases nursing facility rates in response to the pandemic. Amendment 78 is also the Department of Medical Assistance Services, authority for changes in response to the pandemic, also similar. So we'll skip ahead. Amendment number 79 is, again, language that's similar. Department of Medical Assistance Services, this is the flexibility to adjust payment dates when it would behoove us to do so for additional reimbursement under that matching rate. Amendment number 80, under the Department of Medical Assistance Services, this unallots state savings for the enhanced federal match rate for Medicaid. Again, similar, so we won't spend any time on that one. Amendment number 82, this has to do with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, temporary adjustment to the licensing requirements. That for the department proposes to provide discretion for the department to conduct less than one annual unannounced inspection of licensed providers for the calendar year 2020. It also provides the department authority to extend conditional licenses for up to 1 year. Under the state of emergency, would allow the department to issue licensing status letters to children's residential providers due to the lack of on-site inspections and extend the renewal periods of such providers. Amendment number 89 relates to Department of Social Services. This is unallotting state savings from the enhanced federal match rate for foster care program. Again, similar, so we'll skip ahead. Amendment 90, Department of Social Services, authority for licensure exemption and background check portability for child day programs. Also, we covered that one in 29. Companion. Amendment number 91, the Department of Social Services authority for emergency program changes. I believe that one also had a companion, so we'll skip ahead. Amendment number 92, under the Department of Social Services, this modifies the child care transfer language to match language under the Department of Education. This replaces a paragraph in the department that was included in the introduced budget and adopted by the General Assembly that directing the development of a plan by DSS and DOE to transfer the Child Care Development Fund grant from DSS to DOE. So this is more of a technical amendment. Amendment 97 I won't cover, but this is the game and inland and fisheries, again, migratory shorebird permitting program that we talked about in 29. Amendment number 100. This one is more of a technical amendment. This one adjusts funding for legislation that was needed to increase prison beds or woodrum impacts. Under House Bill 30, there was $100,000 that was adopted for together for House Bill 123 and Senate Bill 838. But since they both create an identical felony impact, this is duplicative, so it removes $50,000 general fund dollars. So it's a savings. Amendment number 101. This again is the discharge of certain prisoners and had a companion amendment in 29. Amendment number 107 relates to the Department of State Police. There's a study related to information sharing. This would propose language requiring the state police to provide information from the Central Criminal Records Exchange based on statutes identified in the language that require juvenile records information to be recorded into the CCRE. to the Department of Juvenile Justice upon request, and then de-identify the data. And this is for the purpose of supporting a research project involving Duke University and the University of Virginia relating to provisions of public health and safety. Amendment number 110 relates to under the Secretary of Transportation to the 6-year improvement program. The governor's action would allow the existing 6-year improvement program adopted in June of last year to remain in effect through June of 2021, or until a new program can be adopted based on an official reforecast of revenues to the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. And that would include allocations to public transit operations and the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority. There's some additional notes there as well from the staff. Amendment number 111, this relates to the Secretary of Transportation and the Commonwealth Transportation Board discretionary adjustments. The amendment would allow the board to adjust amounts appropriated, allocated, and distributed to the various transportation agencies and programs to ensure sufficient funding to maintain core operations and services. It does require that any actions to reallocate funding be reported to the chairs of the money committees within 30 days. Amendment number 112 relates to the Department of Aviation and is a technical update to an embedded code citation. Amendment number 113 relates to the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Real ID surcharge. It's a technical amendment because it's reinserting language that authorized the DMV to impose that surcharge. That's currently included in the existing appropriation and was inadvertently removed during budget development, and with delays in this implementation of the Real ID that will continue to be needed through the next biennium. Amendment number 114, also in the Department of Transportation related to I-64 toll revenues. This would add language authorizing the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, or HRTAC, to dedicate I-64 revenues to support other related projects if mutually agreed upon by HRTAC and the Commonwealth Transportation Board. The language is recommended to ensure that HRTAC has the flexibility to pledge regional toll revenues in support of other projects in Hampton Roads, and currently they use the toll road revenues is restricted to supporting expansion of capacity of 64 through Hampton Road Bridge Tunnel. Amendment number 114, also under Department of Transportation. This is a technical one, the Oak Grove Connector Project. It corrects embedded language related to the payment of debt on that one to the City of Chesapeake, consistent with the changes adopted in the omnibus transportation legislation. Amendment number 116, also under the Department of Transportation. This is related to indirect costs from the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. It alters language also to reflect changes in the omnibus transportation bill. Amendment number 117, this is under the Secretary of Veterans and Defense Affairs and has to do with the Camp Pendleton lease agreement, which was also amended in your action before you during the regular session. The governor's action, however, would modify the language to remove the explicit authorization for a 50-year extension for the lease, remove the $50,000 cap on annual lease payments, and provide flexibility in the timing of the initial $5 million payment to coincide with successful execution of a lease between the Commonwealth and the City of Virginia Beach. The amendment provides additional flexibility to the Commonwealth to negotiate those terms. Amendment number 118 and 120 are related. There was some transfer of staffing to the Veteran Services Foundation from the department, and the governor's action would propose to transfer the same amount of funding, but reverses the transfer of the one budget support position. Staff would just note that the position currently, the foundation is currently supported by that budget position. It would the original amendment transferred the position to the actual foundation. Amendment number 122 under Central Appropriations amends redistricting funding language. This amendment just makes a technical adjustment regarding the $1.1 million per year that was to be distributed by the Department of Planning and Budget to agencies for redistricting activities, including the Redistricting Commission if approved. This just provides greater flexibility depending on how that plays out. Amendment number 123 under Central Appropriations have to do with the COVID-19 Response Authority. There was a companion amendment in 29, though I will just note that I believe that the description on this particular amendment references the creation of a legislative advisory committee to provide advice to the governor on allocations of discretionary federal funds. The amendment does not do that, and that was errant language. So I did want to note that. Amendment number 126 is similar to 1 and 29 in the delay of implementation of capital projects. The difference here is it adds similar language as to the reallotments, where it says that you have to come back and reauthorize the capital budget when you accept a reforecast that confirms revenue estimated in the act. Amendment number 127. This is a capital outlay amendment. This would be to enhance Nottoway wastewater treatment plant capacity. There was $15 million in each year under the Department of Corrections for an infrastructure fund for repairs, renovations, et cetera, of facilities. However, the Department of Corrections would argue that they were unaware that the Virginia Center for Behavioral Rehabilitation under Behavioral Health was not going to go after that funding because the additional wastewater capacity that needs to be addressed at the plant is necessary because of the expansion of the Virginia Center for Behavioral Rehabilitation. It might sound similar to a project that you adopted when you did the bill in the regular session, but that was actually for potable water, so this would be the second project related to that Nottoway area. Amendment number 128 would be to unallot the Accomat Airport hangar of the general fund dollars, and that was covered on a slide as well, so I won't spend any time on that one. Amendment number 129 relates to matching funds for pandemic response renovations at the Veteran Care Centers in Richmond and in Roanoke. Amendment number 130 has to do with supplanting of general fund maintenance reserve fundings with bond proceeds. You might remember in the first year of the big bill on fiscal year 2021, there was $65 million in general fund cash in maintenance reserve. This would take that cash and put it to debt in order to achieve savings. Amendment number 131 is for equipment for the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center. This is a project that's coming online, and I would call it a technical amendment as the request did not come in time previously, but is one you would typically do. Amendment number 132 under central capital outlay. This one unallots the general fund dollars that were in support for planning under capital outlay. One of the earlier PowerPoint slides also lists those amounts as well. Amendment number 133 unallots funding for a Virginia Beach project. There was $10 million in general fund dollars to support improvements related to the Nemo Parkway Phase 7B project related to hurricane evacuation for Sandbridge residents. That would be unallotted. Amendment number 134 related to interfund transfers. This requires transfers of COVID-19 FEMA reimbursements to the general fund. That was similar, I believe, to 1 and 29, so we won't spend a lot of time on that one. Amendment number 135 allows institutions flexibility with auxiliary cost recoveries under higher ed. There is a companion amendment in 29. Amendment number 136 is the abatement of tax interest, also a companion to 1 and 29. Amendment number 137, this is the FOIA or allow policy-making boards to meet virtually, so we won't cover that one as it's a companion amendment. And Aubrey, Secretary Lane, referenced the 15% amendment and discussed that earlier. This is the actual write-up on that amendment, including the current language that is there in more detail for your review, but as he mentioned, they were planning to rescind that amendment. Amendment number 139, this is the reversion of appropriations and reappropriations. This has to do with higher ed institutional reserve. There was a companion amendment to that one as well. Amendment 140, also a companion amendment, relates to the accepting of donations and gifts. Amendment number 141 relates to cost factors. There was the changing of cost factors, companion amendment as well. And then 142, there was a companion amendment for that one as well, and it's the authority to establish new services to respond to the pandemic. Amendment number 143 is the companion to the deadline, one where the governor can move the deadline for certain reports or studies, et cetera. Amendment number 144 is, again, that temporary borrowing amendment that I mentioned, and again, potentially duplicative to the one in House Bill 29. And Madam Chair, that completes the presentation, unless there are questions.
Have a deep breath, April. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Does anybody have a question?
I have a question.
Okay. I think that's Barbara.
It is, yes. Yes,
okay.
Barbara Favola. Thank you. April, you just covered, it was Amendment 139, and you talked about allowing institutions to expand or to have greater authorization on their carry forward from 3% to 6%. Will there be guidelines coming forth on that institutions of higher learning will have to follow if they can apply that 6%?
Senator Favola, Madam Chair, the current practice is to allow that, to allow 3%. I'm assuming that those, and Sarah Herzog could potentially add more to this as well, but I'm assuming that those same guidance would be in place, but we could also ask the Secretary of Finance as well.
Thank you very much. I have actually been asked that question, so thank you.
Secretary Lane, are you still on? Sarah?
Yes, we are. We would assume the same guidance with the 3% and the 6%.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. That's a helpful, definitive answer, so thank you very much for that.
Is there another question?
Janet?
Yes.
Baslog. How many of these can we put into a block?
Well, I'm hoping we'll be able to do the unallotted into a block. We'll be able to do technical into a block.
Okay.
April, are you thinking?
Madam Chair, if you refer to the PowerPoint, the reason I listed those amendments in that way is so that you could consider doing that if you wanted to. And of course, a couple of our staff members will be physically present at the Science Museum facility on Wednesday, and everyone else will be available electronically or actually physically in the office. So we'll be available to help with that or answer any questions once the House, as you know, has the amendments first, so we can help update any potential blocks as well.
And I hope they'll do blocks, but we never know.
I don't think they know what the hell they're going to do.
Oh dear.
Oh no. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Janet, this is Tommy. I would just say on the block issue, and I would say this whether it was a Republican or a Democratic governor, so I don't want anybody to take umbrage as it being. I think, that we all need to read those budget amendments over, the language very carefully. I appreciate that we're in extraordinary times, but I want to be sensitive that we are not, even under these times, empowering the executive branch to have unusual authority that might be used as a precedent going forward. So I don't say that critically or adversarially. I just think it's something we need to be aware of.
Tommy, this Saslaw, keep in mind they can't spend a penny of that unless we reauthorize it.
I'm perfectly aware of that, Dick. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, but also, when I'm saying a block, I'm assuming any senator can take any amendment out of the block.
Right.
So,
right.
In any event, I guess I'm bending over backwards to trying to make this go as quickly as possible, but I understand there'll be some controversial ones that will be debated, and I'm also painfully aware that the House has to send them over to us before we can even begin. So be prepared, as they say. Okay, any other comments?
Madam Chair, this is April. I just wanted to mention to the senators on the committee that the bill summaries related to the other bills that came through the committee will be sent separately for their review as typical during this period of time.
Great.
Thanks,
April. And I want to thank April, you and your staff, Aubrey, you and your. It's very helpful, and I know you all are working incredibly hard, and we all appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to also thank the cooperation we've had with April and her staff. It's been exemplary, and we very much appreciate it, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Good. Okay, well, see everybody Wednesday.
See you Wednesday. Thank you.